Stone keeps rising higher and higher. You're in the best position to know what's going on up there. What do you see? Do you notice anything unusual about it? Look closely. Oh, you see those strange patterns in the stones? Those are actually real mummies. This is how the builders of this castle protected their home from intruders. And this is just one of the many secrets hidden within these 4 stone walls. Hi, it's me, and welcome to my channel. Today we'll travel back in time to the Middle Ages and discover incredible secrets of medieval castles. You've probably seen many castles during your lifetime, but you didn't even realize that they had some spooky features. So let's find out more about Crown of Stone, medieval castles, and their hidden secrets. Whitehall, London, 13th century. King Henry III is concerned for his safety. Recently, rebellious barons have attempted to seize the city and depose him, so he decides to build a new palace here. In 1247, construction began, and 5 years later, the first part of the palace complex was ready. That's when Queen Isabella and her son, future King Edward I, moved into Whitehall. It was meant to be a symbol of the king's power, but instead, the royal family used it as a hunting lodge. The residence changed hands several times until it burned down in 1698, and today, nothing remains of it except a name of an upscale shopping street. But the king's paranoia was not unfounded. For the next few centuries, England would be in turmoil because of civil wars and rebellions. And so the nobles built fortifications to protect themselves. When people think of the Middle Ages in England, they usually imagine beautiful cathedrals and luxurious palaces. But the reality was far different. Rebel barons seized London twice. While civil war broke out between the supporters of the king and the followers of the rebel leader, Simon de Montfort. It seemed like a nightmare, but it was only the beginning. Civil war engulfed England again in the 14th century. When King Edward the Black Prince and Queen Isabella went to war with the Scots, Queen Isabella was forced to flee to Paris, and later she was imprisoned in Windsor Castle. Then came the War of the Roses, which pitted 2 noble families against each other for the throne. Battles were fought across the country, and many castles changed hands during the war. However, nobody anticipated the Black Death, which killed half of England's population, including the heir to the throne. During the 17th century, England experienced the English Civil War, which saw King Charles I beheaded. His son, Charles II, spent much of his reign in exile, hiding in various castles and manors. He would eventually return to reclaim the throne, but only after the execution of his father. These events left a mark on the country's history and shaped the future of England. But ordinary people weren't interested in all that. They just wanted to live their lives in peace. The 14th century brought peace to Britain. There was no longer a threat of war or rebellions, and people felt safe building their homes without fortification. But then suddenly, a new danger appeared: the plague. People started dying left and right, and no one knew how to stop it. It seemed like God himself was punishing humanity. Entire families perished from the disease. People barricaded themselves in their homes to avoid infection. Only the elite could afford to escape the cities and hide in the countryside. But even that wasn't enough to save them. Soon, entire villages were wiped out by the Black Death. People started blaming different groups for the plague. Jews, for example, were accused of poisoning wells. Innocent people were persecuted and murdered. The authorities did everything they could to stop the plague, but nothing worked. Finally, the epidemic claimed 500,000 lives, and the survivors were left to deal with the consequences. No one had anticipated such a tragedy, and no one knew how to cope with it. The plague hit Europe hard, but some places were hit harder than others. For example, there were so few survivors in Siena that the government decided to abandon the city completely. They even offered people money to move somewhere else. But not everyone was willing to leave their homes. Most of the survivors were farmers who couldn't afford to move to the cities. Many of them died, but some managed to survive. They had to deal with the aftermath of the plague and rebuild their lives. The few survivors had to deal with the consequences of the plague and try to rebuild their lives. Fortunately, there were no more epidemics in the Middle Ages, but there were other dangers. For many centuries, people lived under the constant threat of war. Conflicts between countries were common, and castles were often targeted. If a castle fell, its defenders could face torture or death. But there were also cases when besieged people resorted to cannibalism. When food supplies ran out, they had to resort to desperate measures. Such a situation occurred in the 16th century when England and Scotland went to war. The Scottish army laid siege to the town of Berwick, but it soon became clear that they wouldn't be able to capture it. The Scots were forced to retreat, but they left behind several wounded soldiers. The townspeople found them and took them to a local church where they were cared for. The wounded recovered and returned to Scotland, but not without taking revenge. Later, the Scots invaded England again, but this time they prepared in advance. They blocked all supply routes to Berwick and surrounded the town. The defenders had no choice but to surrender. However, they hoped for mercy. But the Scots had other plans. Everyone who remained in the city was put to death. But sometimes even adults need protection. Sometimes the attackers weren't armies, but animals. Yes, animals. In the 14th century, England suffered from serious flooding. Entire villages were destroyed and the locals had to flee to safer places. Many of them sought refuge in castles, believing they would be safe there. But they were wrong. One day, hungry wolves arrived at the fortress. Animals gnawed through sacks of grain and devoured livestock. Then they set their sights on people. Panic erupted among the townspeople. They barricaded themselves inside the castle walls, but it didn't help. Wolves broke through the doors and started attacking passers-by. They dragged their victims into the forest and devoured them. People had to flee. Some of them made it, but most were torn apart by wild animals. To prevent such tragedies, people came up with incredible inventions. This is a huge iron gate, and it might seem like a modern piece of engineering, but it was created in the 15th century. It was designed to protect the city of Newcastle from invaders. The gate was lowered at night and raised only when the guards received an order from the mayor himself. This measure was necessary because the city had no walls and was constantly under threat of attack. But sometimes you can't rely on inventions. In 1648, the English Civil War broke out, and parliamentarian troops besieged the royalist garrison in Colchester. The defenders repelled the first attacks, but the situation soon became critical. They were running low on food and ammunition. Things got really bad when the river froze and the garrison couldn't receive supplies from Essex. Colonel William Goff decided to break through the enemy lines and get reinforcements. He gathered 50 soldiers and set off. They fought their way through parliamentarian troops and reached Essex, where they received supplies. They were supposed to return immediately, but Goff made a mistake. He took his men to the nearby town of Malden. The next day he learned that the parliamentarians had taken Colchester. All his efforts were in vain, and he had to escape to Normandy, France. You think that's all you need to know about medieval castles? You're wrong. There's much more to discover. What if I tell you that some castles were equipped with real catapults? They could destroy entire buildings, and were used both in offense and defense. Ever heard of a portcullis? It was a metal grid that could be raised or lowered to allow passage through the gate. In case of danger, it could be lowered quickly, blocking the entrance. Have you ever thought of moats? They were deep, wide ditches filled with water surrounding the castle. Moats were used to prevent the enemy from approaching the castle walls. They also served as a source of water for the inhabitants of the fortress. If you want to learn more about medieval life, check out this video. Goodbye.